they may face there. And as a result, the North Korean women living in the red zone, as Katrina mentioned, live in permanent fear of being captured and punished. And as of 2022, NKDB has recorded 8,122 cases of forced repatriation from China to the DPRK. And of course, once returned to the DPRK, women are interrogated and imprisoned, often without trial. During this interrogation, the women are labeled as traitors simply for crossing the border for a brighter future for themselves or for their family. These repatriated women are subject to inhumane and degrading treatment by guards at detention facilities. They're not just spoken to in a derogatory manner, but they are subjected to humiliating treatment. They are systematically subjected to invasive body searches, which are conducted by guards in the presence of prisoners and other guards and serve the purpose of just stealing money that repatriated women may have brought with them from China. In 2014, the UNCOI report found that repatriated women who become pregnant while in China are subject to forced abortion. This forced abortion and infanticide against repatriated mothers and their children occurs based on gender and racial grounds. Moreover, sexual violence against female detainees is rampant in facilities operated by the North Korean law enforcement agencies known as the Ministry of State Security and Ministry of Social Security. This includes rape, coercion of sex acts in exchange for an improvement in treatment within the detention facilities, such as access of food or medical care. In the instance that a North Korean woman falls pregnant after being raped by this very official, they must undergo a forced abortion to cover up the acts of the MSS official. 46% of the documented cases of sexual violence in our database has occurred in the facilities operated by these two agencies. As I mentioned, women became the breadwinners after the Great Famine. They were strong, persistent, tough, and diligent in order to feed their families. They have dominated an informal economy estimated to contribute more than 70% of the country's household incomes. And while the rest of the world has opened up since the coronavirus pandemic, the draconian lockdown measures that were imposed by the DPRK government in January 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic remains today. During this lockdown, North Korean women are expected to pay a disproportionately heavy price. The regime, fearful of unrest amid chronic food shortages, is moving to reassert state control over the very areas of the informal areas dominated by women. Many of the economic opportunities afforded to North Korean women in recent decades have been closed off as the regime maintains its stranglehold on cross-border trade, and Kim Jong-un attempts to reassert his control over market mechanisms that sprang up in response to the collapse of the rationing system. The ability to make money by bringing in goods from abroad and the ability to escape were the two main pressure valves for many women in North Korea, and now both are under threat. 80% of the North Koreans who had no choice but to leave their homes behind to live in South Korea are women. That is 80% of those who can highlight the reality of North Korea behind what is reported and also not reported by the North Korean government. 80% are women. There is a vicious cycle of gender-based violence that is inflicted on women who cross the border, from trafficking, forced repatriation, arbitrary detention, and sexual violence. We ask you as the international community to break this vicious cycle. We ask you to take steps to protect victims of human rights violations by providing assistance, by funding organizations who assist North Koreans from fleeing the country, and to create a victim and witness protection system. We ask you to expand the psychosocial support for North Korean victims, especially victims of sexual gender-based violence, with a focus on counseling, medical assistance, and support programs to increase public awareness of this problem, while subsequently actively exploring all possible legal pathways to accountability. The scale of the discrimination and violence against women and girls in the DPRK is something that can no longer be ignored, and the international community has an obligation to respond. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. That's a very powerful statement. And considering that cycle of violence and the scale of discrimination, I think it's fitting that we turn next to our colleague from CEDAW, to reflect on some of that. So I'm delighted to introduce Miss Lenati, and she's, as we've discussed, a member of CEDAW. She's a fellow at the University of Cambridge and was a rapporteur that led the drafting of the UN CEDAW General Recommendations on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration, which was adopted in 2020. In 2002, she won the Fulbright grant and conducted research in the State University of New York. And in 2005, she went on to be awarded the American Association of University of Women International Research Scholarship. She is widely published as well. And in 2017, critically for this panel, she chaired CEDAW's constructive dialogue with the official delegation of the Democratic People Republic of Korea. Now, CEDAW have repeatedly called on the DPRK regime to act and address the violations that are occurring against women and girls. And as we've noted in our position paper, this global call to action contrasts starkly with the recent declaration by North Korea in its voluntary national review, which was published in 2021. And this was on the implementation of the SDGs in the 2030 agenda. And it was stated in that declaration that the DPRK had in fact achieved gender equality and had met all targets in relation to the SDGs, in relation to promoting the rights of women and girls. And again, I think as we'll hear from other panelists this morning and some of the statistics that Hannah has just shared with you, I don't think that can be an accurate statement. The legal consequences of North Korea's non-implementation of CEDAW is one of the justice pathways that global rights compliance have explored. And this is in addition to calling on the North Korean government to submit a report on an exceptional basis, responding to the allegations that you've heard today and elsewhere on the grave and systematic violations of women's human rights that are occurring now. So I'm delighted to hand over to you, Ms. Lenati, so you can contribute to discussions on promoting and protecting women and girls.
Thank you very much for this introduction to my activity and my work at the CEDAW committee. And I have a few minutes just in order to brief all of you of the history of CEDAW and our committee's engagement with the government of North Korea. So in general, North Korea have been engaged with 3 human rights treaty bodies. It's Committee of Rights of Child, Committee of Rights of Disabled Persons, and our Committee on Elimination of Discrimination against women. The CEDAW's engagement with North Korea started in 2005 when the government introduced its first initial periodic report. And then there was a very long gap. And in 2017, when I was the chair of the CEDAW committee, it was very commendable from the side of the CEDAW committee that the government of North Korea, they decided to report its 2nd to 4th periodic reports to the CEDAW committee. We valued it. And but the constructive dialogue was not even, but we started this dialogue, and it went through the long day, and we issued concluding observations. But from that moment, our engagement with North Korea, it has stopped. Just because in 24 months, according to the CEDAW's procedure, the government of North Korea had to send to the secretariat follow-up and to cover and to explain how the government implemented 4 concluding observations that we selected after our constructive dialogue. But they never came back. And then in 2020, CEDAW committee sent a letter to a permanent representative of North Korea, and they didn't respond also to this letter either. And they also didn't submit fifth periodic report to CEDAW committee. But I have to tell that, according to my knowledge, the government submitted its periodic report to the Committee of Rights of Disabled Persons. So maybe there is still some hope that fifth periodic report will be submitted to the CEDAW too. So what we can do in this situation of silence? So one option was mentioned, and actually it was suggested by me, because in the rules of procedures, we have this possibility of exceptional reporting when there is no any engagement from the state party, and we know that concluding observations are not implemented, and the situation on women and girls are becoming grave and worse with each passing day. But in general, in the 40 years of CEDAW work, we had only once implementing this exceptional reporting procedure in the case of Myanmar. But such a possibility is, of course, open, and it's very realistic. But other possibilities which are really will be applied will happen in May during the CEDAW session. It will be 85th CEDAW session, and during this session we will have a report from China. And China will divide its engagement with CEDAW in hybrid format. We will have hopefully some members of the official delegation here in Geneva and some online. And definitely we will have to ask the government of China some questions that we are not able to ask during the previous dialogue, just because we didn't have details what have been happening with those escapees from, especially women and girls from North Korea during this route through China. And we know in general from interviews that Chinese villagers, they were helping women who escaped North Korea, but at the same point and at the same time, we have many cases that women are trafficked for sexual purposes, and they are trafficked for forced marriages in China. And then we have those cases of forced repatriation. So all those questions will be asked and raised during the CEDAW's 85th session in May. And then we also will have some issues to be raised with the government of Republic of Korea that again have not been raised when we had this dialogue in 2018. For example, we know that children who have been born in those Chinese villages and they do not have birth certificates, when they are brought to, at last, when they are brought to safety to Republic of Korea, they still are not receiving birth certificates, and they are still stateless. So these issues, at least this one, definitely will be raised during our dialogue with the government of Republic of Korea. So I think it's, yes, these are aspects and issues that I wanted to raise in our, before starting our interactive engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for outlining some of those options and just how exceptional some of those may be. I'm also hopeful that perhaps the 5th periodic report, there may be some results there, and I hope that the session in May can lead to further encouragement and engagement on that point. I'd now like to turn to some more direct examples of the scale and nature of violence experienced by women and girls by our partner, Mr. Ethan Shin from Transitional Justice Working Group. So Ethan is a legal analyst based at that group, and he has been interviewing North Korean escapees in South Korea to record, in particular, enforced disappearances and other grave human rights violations. They have made submissions to the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances and other UN human rights experts on behalf of their project called Footprints, which is an online database of the people taken by North Korea. He is a brilliant advocate for the reform of South Korea's joint interrogation procedure for the newly arrived escapees from North Korea, and the creation of a governmental fact-finding commission for the Korean War-era prisoners of war, and South Korea's implementation of the International Convention for the Protection of Persons from Enforced Disappearance. The Transitional Justice Working Group is a leading organization, and they have an extensive database as well on abductions and arbitrary detentions. They cooperate and share experience with other organizations and individuals who take lead in human rights documentation work and accountability for mass atrocities. So today, Ethan's going to give us an overview of the history and scale and how this is being used to terrorize North Korean people and the hidden impact of those enforced disappearances on the women that are left behind, a subject that has not yet been publicly discussed. So thank you, Ethan.
Thank you, Kat, for that introduction. As Kat just explained, my NGO, TJWG, has been investigating the abductions and disappearances committed by North Korea, both at home and abroad. And we have created an online database known as the Footprints. Since its creation in 1948, the DPRK has been using enforced disappearances as a tool to terrorize its population into submission, and also as a source of slave labor. While the abduction of up to 100,000 South Korean civilians, non-repatriation of 50,000 South Korean POWs, the disappearance of at least 93,000 ethnic Koreans from Japan, and the kidnappings of other Japanese and other nationals have been documented to some extent, there is limited information about the true scale of the single largest victim class, that being the North Korean people themselves. In the case of internal disappearances, the remaining family members, including women, are often given stark choices. They can divorce their disappeared husbands to avoid retribution, or refuse to divorce and face social ostracization, economic deprivation, or even imprisonment or exile with their children. The women and their children left behind after the disappearances of their husbands and fathers often face confiscation of family properties and loss of the income earner, which results in their economic hardship. This leaves them vulnerable to exploitation and in some cases, trafficking in persons to China. Children of parents subject to enforced disappearances, both boys and girls, can also be abducted for adoption by other families. As the ICC's arrest warrant against Mr. Putin last Friday demonstrates, such forcible transfer of children is a grave human rights violation, as well as an international crime under international law. In other serious human rights issues too, it is important to take into consideration the gender aspect. Last month, our organization TJWWG published a comprehensive report concerning the risk of radioactive contamination from North Korea's Punggye-ri nuclear test site. While the radioactive contamination may affect hundreds of thousands of North Koreans living in the vicinity, there may be particular risks for women, such as stillbirths or birth defects for mothers. Because of the traditional gender role in North Korean society, women are also expected to do house chores, like drawing water from springs or wells, which may increase the risk of their exposure to radiation. For too long, even as we approach the 10th anniversary of the COI report, North Korea has been allowed to commit grave human rights violations, including institutionalized violence and discrimination against women and girls with impunity. To end this unacceptable impunity, we urge the international community to take the following concrete actions. For its wanton violations of CEDAW obligations, the CEDAW Committee should request the DPRK to submit a report on an exceptional basis pursuant to Room 48.5 of its Rules of Procedure, as Dahlia just suggested. During its consideration of China's 9th periodic report on May 12, the CEDAW Committee also has a chance to raise the issues and make recommendations concerning the persecution and deportation of North Korean refugees, including trafficked women and girls, in violation of the principle of non-refoulement. This is particularly important as North Korea's lifting of the COVID-19 border closure may result in the forcible repatriation of up to 2,000 North Korean detainees in China. The Human Rights Committee should also request the DPRK to submit a special report in situations requiring immediate attention to appropriately address serious violations of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, pursuant to Rule 66.2 of its Rules of Procedure. North Korea's failure to submit a periodic report to the committee for the past 20 years, in addition to the ongoing grave human rights situation, necessitates such a strong response. The UN special procedures also need to take robust steps against North Korea. Among the thematic mandates, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, and the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls have a particularly important role to play. They should consider sending joint letters to the DPRK and China, addressing the systematic violence and discrimination against North Korean women and girls. Such a letter may be joined by other mandates, including the Special Rapporteurs on Migrants' Rights, arbitrary executions, torture, and slavery, as well as Special Rapporteur on DPRK human rights. While the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances has sought clarification for a total of 385 disappearances to North Korea as of May 2022, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, WGAD, has not adopted an opinion concerning the DPRK since 2019. We believe that the WGAD's more robust consideration of cases of arbitrary detention of North Korean women and girls in the DPRK and China is necessary. The upcoming fourth cycle UPRs for China and the DPRK will also be important occasions to discuss and make recommendations concerning the systematic violations and abuses of North Korean women and girls' rights. We ask the member states to actively raise these issues, taking into consideration the views of the CSOs. In the absence of concrete changes in North Korea 10 years after the COI report, we urge the Human Rights Council to consider holding a special session on the grave deteriorating human rights situation in the DPRK, especially with respect to the rights of women and children. This is possible with the support of 1/3 of the membership of the Council, that is 16 members or more, pursuant to Operative Paragraph 10 of the General Assembly Resolution 60-51. If North Korea resumes its nuclear tests or takes other drastic measures that could further deteriorate its already dire human rights situation, the Human Rights Council should convene a special session with added urgency. Lastly, during such an emergency session of the Human Rights Council, we urge the Council to adopt a resolution calling upon the Security Council to refer the situation in DPRK to the International Criminal Court, and also call upon this General Assembly in a special emergency session or in a regular session to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from the DPRK's ongoing violations of CEDAW and other international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan, for that elegant overview. And I think it's a very powerful point in relation to the contrast with the arrest warrant issued on Friday. I think Ukraine continues to dominate all of our headlines and a lot of headspace as well. And I think the children and women in North Korea who are being forcibly transferred and abducted in very similar ways at a scale of which we are not entirely clear is something that we really should be considering more closely. I'd now like to turn in closing to give the floor to Her Excellency Dr. Lee Shin-hwa, Ambassador, as we've said, for the cooperation of North Korean human rights. She is also the president of the Korean Academic Council on the United Nations System, the chair of the Evaluation Committee of the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a member of the Trilateral Commission. She is widely published as well and covers multilateral security and foreign policy. And we are absolutely privileged to have you here this morning to close our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Given the limited time, just let me read what I prepared last night. Thank you for this very important discussion on the violence and discrimination and other human rights abuses against women and girls in North Korea. 10 years ago, here in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution to establish the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK. The following year, the COI released a groundbreaking report emphasizing that there are systematic, widespread, and grave violence of human rights in North Korea, which is equivalent to the responsibility to protect. Since then, the global community, including UN entities, national governments, and the civil society representatives present at this event, have persistently endeavored to address and improve the dire human rights situation in North Korea. However, it is frustrating and saddening to note that North Korea's grave human rights situation, including the violation and abuses of the rights of women and girls inside North Korea and outside, remains to be alarming with no sign of improvement. The situation in North Korea has significantly worsened as a result of strict social controls and prolonged border closure, ostensibly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which only strengthened the North Korea's dictatorial regime control. Serious food shortages have surged in several regions of the country with report of the starvation. But the Kim Jong-un regime has prioritized regime security over the basic right and welfare of its citizens, that what I call North Korea people's human security. The regime continued to develop its nuclear and missile program despite the international effort toward denuclearization. Meanwhile, the overall human rights and humanitarian situation in the DPRK, particularly of vulnerable people, including women and girls, have further worsened. I cannot overstate that linkage between human rights and security. Despite the chronic food shortage in North Korea, the Kim Jong-un fired 71 missiles last year alone. According to estimate by the South Korean Ministry of Unification, the cost of these missiles amount to approximately $200 million, which could be used to purchase 1 million tons of rice. This quantity of rice would be sufficient to meet the country's annual food deficit of 800,000 tons and still have some surplus left over. The possible leakage of radioactive materials from North Korea's Punggye-ri nuclear test site is another area where human rights of not only the North Koreans living in the vicinity, but also people living in the neighboring countries like China, South Korea, and Japan through the export of agriculture and marine production are at risk, as very well highlighted by the Transnational Justice Working Group's report has highlighted. I also want to emphasize the DPRK's international legal obligation to respect the provision of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and other human rights treaties that it has ratified. On the occasion of International Women's Day on March 8th this year, the North Korean Foreign Ministry made a brazen claim that the country's women are enjoying the fullest benefit of the so-called most superior socialist healthcare system in the world. However, the reality contradicts this situation as pervasive human rights abuses against women and girls in North Korea persist, as highlighted by the NKDB presentation. The OHCHR's recent report on promoting accountability in North Korea highlighted heartbreaking cases of female victims subjected to trafficking, forced labor or marriage, and sexual exploitation and forcible repatriation, as highlighted by all the presenters in today's event. Furthermore, women who are often the primary breadwinner in impoverished North Korean households face gender-based discrimination and violence. Despite the North Korean regime's claim that the international call for improving human rights in the countries are politically motivated by hostile forces seeking to overthrow the DPRK regime, it is important for them to acknowledge the international community is simply urging North Korean regime to comply with its obligations, including those related to women's rights. Lastly, I would like to note that North Korean human rights issue encompass diverse and complex issues, including oppression and limited access to food and information, and the treatment of North Korean defectors and overseas laborers, and the plight of victims of enforced disappearance by North Korean authorities from South Korea and other countries. It is crucial that any human rights debate is grounded in international norms and standards rather than politicized. In this context, I call on China to observe the principle of non-refoulement in Article 33 of the Convention relating to the Statute of Refugee and Article 3 of the Convention against torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, as China has ratified both treaties. We also must empathize with the long-standing and heart-wrenching pain of the families of unrepatriated POWs and abductees, and urge the North Korean regime to respond immediately to this issue with one voice from the international community. In conclusion, I once again want to express my gratitude for your unwavering, tireless commitment to improving the dire human rights situation in North Korea over the past several decades. As the Korean ambassador for international cooperation on North Korean human rights, I urge the UN and its member states and European Union and NGOs and other relevant stakeholders to work together to raise awareness about the horrendous human rights violation perpetrated by the Kim Jong-un regime. It is essential that we amplify the voice of the victim and work together to hold the perpetrators accountable. In that sense, I do believe open discussion of the North Korean human rights issue at the UN Security Council is imperative. Only through collaboration can we bring about a just resolution to this long-standing and ongoing crisis in the DPRK. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, we are almost at time, and I would just like to give, before we turn to any comments or statements from the floor, I would just like to give my colleague, Special Rapporteur on the Violence Against Women, Ms. Reem Al-Salam, the opportunity for a few closing remarks as well. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'll be very brief. As you may know, the mandate had in fact visited the DPRK, Korea and Japan back in 1995. Of course, the focus at the time was really the issue of comfort women and the responsibility of Japan, as well as the need to make an apology to the victims and the survivors. And it's unfortunate that since then, I must confess, the mandate hasn't been very active on the issue of the treatment of women and girls from the DPRK. We did join some of the few communications that had been issued by the special procedures in which there was a reference to sexual and gender-based violence, particularly of women detainees. But since then, really, we haven't, I must say, paid a lot of attention, and this is something I'm hoping to rectify, as was mentioned. So I did participate, for example, in the conference that was hosted by the Republic of Korea and the Special Rapporteur for the DPRK in January 2023, and it was really a very good opportunity to get to know very closely the situation, the really horrendous situation of women and girls from North Korea. And I'm very grateful actually to the Special Rapporteur, Ms. Elizabeth Salmon, for prioritizing the situation of women and girls for her first report and through that conference. So just to say that I look to further engaging on the situation, also to be more in contact with North Korean women organizations and human rights organizations working in the region and beyond. And I have also expressed my readiness and interest to conduct a visit to the DPRK, should that be possible, as my mandate is one of those mandates that has a standing invitation. So in addition to the multi-pronged interventions that were suggested, I think this is certainly one that can also be pursued. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think all options on the table is a good idea. Could I ask if there's any interventions or comments or questions from the floor? Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador Lee Xianghua, Special Rapporteur Elizabeth Salmon-Garat, members of the International Federation for Human Rights, and other co-sponsors, including Director Murdoch. Thank you as well. The United States is proud to attend this event. As President Biden has said on numerous occasions, human rights are at the center of the United States foreign policy. The Biden-Harris administration is particularly committed to scrutinizing the human rights situation in North Korea. The commitment is well reflected in the recent nomination of Julie Turner, to serve as the first U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights in 6 years. As the panel on UN Special Rapporteur highlighted, the limited access to food, medicine, and healthcare has had a disproportionate effect on women and girls in North Korea. The continued discrimination and widespread violence against women and girls must continue to be a focus of the Human Rights Council for to push the North Korean government to implement the recommendations. The United States also recognizes the vital role that human rights defenders and NGOs play, including the International Federation for Human Rights, in exposing the horrific human rights abuses against women and girls committed by the North Korean government. We thank the Special Rapporteur for her work and recommendations and recognize the importance of the ongoing monitoring and reporting. We urge all delegations to support the renewal of the Special Rapporteur on the DPRK. My question for the panel is, how can the Human Rights Council strengthen its approach for DPRK to meet its international obligations, including the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women? I thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Would any of my panelists like the opportunity to respond in terms of options for action?
Well, I do believe it's not only applicable to the case of the women and girls, but in general in North Korea. And of course, we have to highlight the vulnerable groups as well. While we have to give the priority to the accountability, I think we have to seek the many ways of how to constructively engage with the North Korean regime. Obviously, North Korean regime is the person who has to be accountable, but at the very same time, we international community have to engage with them to address the problem of or like a human right of the ordinary North Korean people. On that note, I want to know the international community together with the South Korean government is closely working together in unity to having some kind of open and effective and transparent and resilient humanitarian assistance to the North Korea in field. And at the same time, as Ethan has mentioned in his presentation, I do believe the Covenant of the Political Rights, the committee sent some request to North Korea to answer to what they've been doing to promote their political rights. So I think that is a kind of another way we can legally engage with the North Korean regime. And hopefully we, international community together, including US and ASEAN and the EU and South Korean as well, we all can, by support of the international NGOs, of course, as well, to seek some ways to how we can making a so-called constructive engagement workable in the case of the North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ethan, would you have?
Thank you. So one of the proposals included in our position paper is the creation of a group of DPRK friends so that this kind of a discussion of North Korean human rights issues can be more permanent and more lasting. I think it's important to have this kind of long-term strategy and interest in this issue for it to be a long-term, coherent long-term strategy. And as I've set out in the earlier presentation, I think there are avenues that have not been explored yet, both at the Human Rights Council level and also by the treaty bodies, special procedures, and also through the UPR. Lastly, I think it's important to note the role of China and China's responsibility in this situation, and beginning with the CEDAW's review of the periodic report in May. I think it's important to also highlight and hold China accountable for its part in many of the human rights violations against North Korean women and girls that are taking place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that is time for now, but thank you for those rich options and for the engagement and your participation this morning. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and we hope that we can continue these conversations bilaterally. Thank you very much. Thank you.